Have you ever felt trapped in a situation so difficult that it seemed like there was no way out? Like you were in a valley of dry bones, where everything around you is dead, lifeless, and without hope of renewal? The truth is, we all go through moments like that at some point. But there's a powerful message hidden in the story of Ezekiel and the miracle in the valley of dry bones. It's not just an ancient story, it's a revelation about God's transformative power and what He can do in your life, even in the darkest times. In this video, we're going to dive deep into Ezekiel's vision. What seemed impossible, dry bones coming back to life, became one of the greatest examples of how God can restore what appears to be lost forever. And you know what's even more incredible? That same miracle of renewal can happen in your life. What seems impossible today can become the stage for one of the greatest miracles you've ever witnessed. So, if you feel like you're in a place without hope, stick with me until the end of this video. You're going to discover that no matter how dry or barren the valley of your life may seem, there's a miracle waiting, just needing the breath of God to transform everything. Ready to see how God can make the impossible happen? Imagine standing in a desolate valley, where the only thing in sight are dry, lifeless bones scattered across the ground. It's an eerie scene, one that would stir a sense of hopelessness in anyone. Yet, for Ezekiel, this was not just a random sight. It was a powerful vision given to him by God. In this vision, these dry bones would not stay lifeless for long. God had a purpose. He was about to show Ezekiel that even what seems completely dead can be brought back to life. Have you ever faced a situation in your life where all hope seemed lost? In Ezekiel's vision, the bones didn't just lie there in silence. God commanded Ezekiel to speak to these bones, telling them to live again. Can you imagine the disbelief one might feel in such a moment? But Ezekiel obeyed, and as he spoke, something miraculous began to happen. The bones started to come together, forming complete skeletons, and then muscles, skin, and flesh began to cover them. It was nothing short of a miracle, one that left no doubt about God's power. When was the last time you witnessed something you thought was impossible become reality? But this wasn't just a story about bones coming to life. It was a vivid metaphor for Israel's state at that time. Scattered, broken, and feeling spiritually dead. God was showing that no matter how bleak things appeared, He could breathe life into even the most hopeless situations. The vision was a promise of restoration. Today, when we feel like we are facing our own valley of dry bones, when life seems scattered and disconnected, this story reminds us of the miracles God is capable of performing. And if this is possible, what might God be waiting to restore in your life next? The Israelites found themselves in one of the darkest moments of their history. Captivity in Babylon was not just a physical prison, it was a spiritual and emotional one as well. Their homeland was far behind them, their temple, the very symbol of God's presence, was destroyed, and they felt utterly abandoned. It was as if everything they had known and held dear had crumbled into dust. Can you imagine the depth of that despair, where even your faith feels like it has been taken from you? The Israelites weren't just captives of Babylon, they were captives of their own hopelessness. Their despair was palpable. How could they sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land? Their hearts were heavy, their spirits broken. It wasn't just the physical distance from their home, it was the emotional distance they felt from God. Have you ever experienced a season in your life where everything seemed to be falling apart, and you questioned if God was still with you? That's exactly how the Israelites felt. They longed for restoration but couldn't see how it was possible. During this time of captivity, the Israelites likely reflected on the great miracles of the past, like the parting of the Red Sea or the fall of Jericho, but those stories seemed distant, as if miracles were reserved for another time. In their current situation, it was hard to believe that those same miracles could happen again. But here's the thing about despair. It often blinds us to the possibilities that are still within reach. We tend to forget that miracles aren't just historical events but can happen in the here and now. In the midst of their suffering, some may have clung to the words of the prophets, hoping for a sign, a glimpse of the promise that God had not forgotten them. Others may have lost all hope, unable to see beyond their immediate pain. The captivity was not just about losing their land but losing their identity, their sense of purpose. They had once been God's chosen people, and now they were exiles in a foreign land. How could they reconcile their current reality with the promises they had been given? Yet, even in this dark time, there was a glimmer of hope. It's easy to forget, in the depths of despair, that God's promises do not fade with time. The Israelites, though they couldn't see it yet, were on the brink of one of the greatest restorations in their history. Their captivity, their suffering, it was all part of a bigger story, one that was far from over. Sometimes, when we are in our own moments of captivity, it's hard to see the bigger picture. But just as the Israelites would soon learn, despair does not have the final word. This is a powerful reminder that no matter how lost or broken we may feel, God is always working behind the scenes. He hadn't abandoned Israel, and He hasn't abandoned us, even when we can't see the way forward. Just like in Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones, what seems dead and lost can still be revived. It's in these moments that we have to cling to faith, even when it feels like all is lost. What if the darkest moment of your life is actually the beginning of a great restoration? In our lives today, we can often feel like the Israelites in Babylon, trapped by circumstances, weighed down by struggles, and feeling distant from God. But this story teaches us that even in the hardest times, God is still present. It might not feel like it in the moment, but He is always moving, always preparing to bring life back to what seems dead. Have you ever noticed that it's often in the toughest seasons of life that we experience the most growth? Maybe this is why the Israelites had to go through this difficult time, to prepare them for the restoration that was coming. What's incredible about this story is that the Israelites' despair was not the end. It was the setup for a miracle, a complete turnaround. It's a reminder for all of us that no matter how difficult our circumstances, God can take our darkest moments and transform them into something beautiful. The Israelites didn't know it yet, but they were on the verge of witnessing one of the greatest miracles of all time. And the same is true for us. We may be closer to our breakthrough than we think. So, what if your season of despair is simply the beginning of something greater? When Ezekiel stood in the valley of dry bones, God posed a profound question. Can these bones live? It's a question that challenges the very limits of human belief. In that moment, Ezekiel had a choice. Would he look at the impossible and accept it as final, or would he trust that God could do the miraculous? It's a question we all face at some point, isn't it? When life presents us with seemingly dead situations, do we believe that God can bring them back to life, or do we surrender to the despair of the moment? God's question to Ezekiel wasn't just about the bones, it was about faith. Ezekiel's response is telling. He didn't claim to know the answer, but he also didn't dismiss the possibility. "O sovereign Lord, you alone know," he said, leaving the door open for God's power to be revealed. In many ways, this is the posture we're called to take in life. We don't always know how things will turn out, but we can choose to believe that God knows, and that He is capable of working miracles beyond our understanding. How often do we let our doubts keep us from expecting miracles? As Ezekiel prophesied to the bones, something amazing began to happen. There was a noise, a rattling sound, as the bones started to come together. What had been scattered across the valley now began to unite into full skeletons. This is a vivid picture of how God works in our lives. What once seemed broken and disjointed can suddenly start to come together in ways we never imagined. Sometimes, all it takes is one word from God to begin the process of restoration. Have you ever seen something in your life that was once broken start to come back together? The scene that unfolds in the valley is one of power and awe. But it wasn't just the physical restoration that mattered. Even as the bones formed skeletons and flesh covered them, they were still lifeless. It wasn't until God commanded the breath to enter them that they became alive. This is a powerful reminder that it's not enough for things to just look right on the outside. True life, true restoration, comes from the Spirit of God. We can try to put things back together on our own, but without God's breath, without His Spirit, it's all just a lifeless form. How often do we focus on external fixes without inviting God to breathe life into the situation? God's message to Ezekiel was clear. What seems impossible is never out of reach for Him. He can bring life to what is dead, and hope to what seems hopeless. This message wasn't just for Ezekiel, it was for the entire nation of Israel, and it's for us today. When God asks, "Can these bones live?" it's not just a question, it's an invitation. An invitation to believe in miracles, to trust that no matter how dry or scattered the bones of our lives may seem, God can and will bring them back to life. In this moment, God was not just restoring bones. He was restoring faith. Faith in His power, His promises, and His ability to bring about miracles even in the most dire situations. It's a message we need to hear today, especially when we're faced with challenges that seem insurmountable. When we're in the valley of our own lives, surrounded by dry bones, whether it's broken relationships, lost dreams, or personal failures, God's question echoes in our hearts: can these bones live? And our answer, like Ezekiel's, should always be, "O sovereign Lord, you alone know." This story also serves as a powerful metaphor for the way God speaks into our lives. Just as Ezekiel was called to prophesy to the bones, we are called to speak life into the dead areas of our own circumstances. It's easy to get discouraged, to focus on what's missing or broken, but God calls us to speak in faith. Speak to the bones of your life, whether it's your career, your health, your relationships, and trust that as you do, God will begin to work in ways you never thought possible. When was the last time you spoke life into a situation that seemed hopeless? Ultimately, God's question to Ezekiel wasn't just about the bones. It was about trust. Do we trust that God can do the impossible? Do we believe that He can bring life where there is death, hope where there is despair? This is the heart of faith, believing that even when we can't see how, God is still at work. And just like Ezekiel witnessed the miracle of the bones coming to life, we, too, can witness the miracles God wants to perform in our lives. But it all begins with faith. So, what is the impossible situation in your life that you need to bring before God? The Valley of Dry Bones wasn't just a strange vision for Ezekiel. It was a powerful symbol. This image of lifeless bones scattered across the valley represented the state of Israel at that time. Spiritually dead, cut off, and hopeless. Just as those bones were disjointed and without life, so too was Israel. They had been scattered, their temple destroyed, and they were in exile, feeling far from God. This was a nation that had lost everything, including their sense of identity and purpose. Have you ever felt like everything in your life was disconnected, without hope or direction? As the bones came together in Ezekiel's vision, it was a clear message of restoration. God wasn't just interested in physically bringing the Israelites back to their land. He was going to breathe new life into their very souls. The bones coming together symbolized that even though Israel was scattered, God would unite them again. This was about much more than geography. It was about a spiritual revival. Often in life, we focus on external circumstances, thinking that if those could just change, everything would be better. But sometimes, the restoration we need goes much deeper, into the core of who we are. When God asked Ezekiel if the bones could live, He was also asking whether Israel could live again, whether they could be restored not just physically, but spiritually. This wasn't just about bringing people back to a land. It was about bringing them back to a relationship with God. It's easy to think that restoration is only about fixing the things around us, our jobs, our homes, our relationships. But true restoration begins in the heart. Without that inner transformation, the outward changes don't mean much. Think about the times in your life when you focused on fixing the outside, only to realize that the real work needed to happen within. The symbol of the dry bones teaches us that no situation is beyond hope. Even when everything seems dead, God can bring it back to life. But restoration doesn't happen overnight. In Ezekiel's vision, the bones came together, but they were still lifeless until God breathed His Spirit into them. This reminds us that while we can take steps towards restoration, true life comes from God's Spirit. Have you ever tried to fix something on your own, only to realize later that you needed God's help to truly bring it to life? What's amazing about this vision is that it wasn't just for the Israelites in Ezekiel's time, it's a message for us today. We all have areas in our lives that feel like a valley of dry bones, places where we feel disconnected, lifeless, and without hope. But God promises that He can bring restoration, just like He did for Israel. This story is a powerful reminder that God is in the business of bringing life to what seems dead, whether it's a broken relationship, a dream that feels lost, or even our own sense of purpose. What is your valley of dry bones, and how can you invite God to breathe new life into it? Ezekiel's vision also challenges us to look beyond the surface. On the outside, the bones were dead and scattered, but God saw what they could become. In the same way, we often look at the dead areas of our lives and assume they can't be restored. But God sees the potential for life, even in the places we've given up on. It's easy to get discouraged when we focus on what's wrong, but what if we started to see our struggles as opportunities for God to work a miracle? The next time you feel hopeless, remember that God specializes in bringing life to the lifeless. This vision of restoration is also a call to trust. When God asked Ezekiel if the bones could live, He was inviting Ezekiel to trust in His power. And when God breathed life into the bones, he showed that restoration isn't something we do on our own. It's something God does through his Spirit. We can make all the plans we want, but without God's breath, without his Spirit moving in our lives, those plans are just lifeless bones. So, what would it look like to invite God's Spirit into your situation, to trust that he can bring life where there seems to be only death? Finally, the valley of dry bones is a promise. It's a promise that no matter how far we've wandered, no matter how broken or lost we feel, God can bring us back. It's a reminder that restoration is always possible with God, even when it seems impossible to us. The Israelites had given up hope, but God hadn't given up on them. And he hasn't given up on us, either. So, when we're in our own valleys, when life feels scattered and disconnected, we can trust that God is working to bring everything back together. What if your current situation is just the beginning of God's restoration? The story of Ezekiel and the Valley of Dry Bones is not just an ancient vision for a distant time. It's a powerful metaphor for our lives today. We all face moments when everything feels lost, when the circumstances around us seem as bleak and lifeless as that valley of bones. Whether it's a broken relationship, a job that's going nowhere, or a dream that feels out of reach, we all know what it's like to stand in that valley and wonder if there's any hope left. But just as God breathed life into those bones, he can breathe life into the areas of our lives that feel dead. Have you ever felt like something in your life was too far gone to be restored? One of the key lessons from this story is that no situation is beyond God's reach. Just as Ezekiel witnessed the impossible, bones coming to life, we too are called to believe in the power of God to do the miraculous in our own lives. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy or that everything will be restored exactly as we want, but it does mean that with God, there is always hope. We often try to solve problems on our own, forgetting that true restoration comes when we invite God to breathe his Spirit into our situation. What would it look like to ask God to breathe new life into the places where you feel stuck or hopeless? In practical terms, applying this story to our lives means shifting our perspective from despair to hope. Instead of focusing on what's missing or broken, we can choose to focus on what God can do. This isn't about ignoring reality. It's about acknowledging that with God, there's always more going on than we can see. For example, if you're facing challenges in your career, instead of giving up, you could start by asking God to guide your next steps, trusting that he can open doors you never imagined. Or if you're dealing with a difficult relationship, you might invite God to work in both your heart and theirs, trusting that he can bring healing where there's been hurt. How might this shift in perspective change the way you approach the challenges in your life? Another powerful takeaway from this story is the importance of speaking life into dead situations. Just as Ezekiel prophesied to the bones, we can speak words of hope and faith into our own circumstances. This isn't just about being positive, it's about declaring God's promises over our lives, even when we can't see the outcome yet. If you're struggling with finances, instead of giving in to fear, you can speak God's provision over your situation. If you're feeling overwhelmed by anxiety, you can declare God's peace. What are the areas in your life where you need to start speaking life instead of doubt? Ultimately, this story reminds us that God is always in the business of restoration. No matter how broken or lifeless something may seem, God can breathe life into it. It may not happen overnight, and it may not happen in the way we expect, but with God, nothing is ever truly lost. This truth gives us the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. What if the places in your life that seem the most hopeless are actually the ones where God is getting ready to do something incredible? God's promise to restore Israel wasn't just about bringing them back to their land, it was about bringing them back to life. In the same way that he breathed life into the dry bones in Ezekiel's vision, God promised to breathe new life into his people. This restoration was more than physical. It was spiritual, emotional, and communal. The Israelites had been cut off, feeling abandoned and forgotten, but God assured them that he hadn't given up on them. He was still their God, and they were still his people. Have you ever felt distant from God, as though he's forgotten about you? This promise of restoration wasn't just for the Israelites, it's for us today as well. We all have moments in life where we feel lost, broken, or far from where we want to be. But just as God promised to restore Israel, he promises to restore us too. This restoration may not always come in the ways we expect, but it's a reminder that God is always working on our behalf, even when we can't see it. What areas of your life do you need to trust God to restore? When God breathed life into the bones, they didn't just become whole, they became an army. This is a powerful symbol of how God's restoration goes beyond just fixing what's broken. He transforms it into something even greater than before. The Israelites, once a scattered and defeated people, would become strong again. And in our own lives, God's restoration doesn't just bring us back to where we were, it takes us to new heights. Have you ever experienced a time when God not only restored something in your life but made it even better than you imagined? Restoration requires patience and trust. Just as the Israelites had to wait for God's timing, we too must trust that God's plan for restoration is unfolding in our lives, even when it seems slow. It can be hard to wait, especially when we want things to change right away, but God's timing is always perfect. Sometimes, the waiting is part of the restoration process, preparing us for what's to come. How can you practice trusting God's timing in your life, even when it feels like nothing is happening? Ultimately, God's promise of restoration is a reminder that no matter how far we've fallen, we're never beyond His reach. The Israelites were in exile, feeling hopeless and forgotten, yet God had a plan to bring them back to life. And He has the same plan for us. Whether it's a broken dream, a fractured relationship, or a loss of faith, God can restore it all. His promise is that nothing is too far gone for Him to revive. So, where in your life do you need to believe in God's promise of restoration? When God posed the question to Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" He wasn't asking for Ezekiel's knowledge. He was inviting him into a deeper faith. This question challenges all of us to look beyond what is possible by human standards and to trust in God's ability to do the impossible. In the natural, dry bones don't just come back to life. But with God, the laws of nature bend, and the impossible becomes reality. Have you ever faced a situation where it seemed like there was no possible way out, and yet, God made a way? Faith isn't just about believing in what's possible. It's about trusting in God when everything seems impossible. Ezekiel didn't know how the bones could live, but he trusted that God could do it. That's the kind of faith we're called to have in our own lives. When we're faced with situations that seem dead, whether it's a relationship, a career, or even our own sense of purpose, we're called to believe that God can bring it back to life. It's in these moments of impossibility that God's power is most clearly displayed. What areas of your life seem impossible right now, and how can you bring them before God in faith? One of the most challenging aspects of faith is that it often requires us to act before we see the outcome. Ezekiel was told to prophesy to the bones, to speak life into them, even though they were still dead and scattered. This is a powerful lesson for us today. Sometimes, God calls us to speak in faith before we see any signs of change. We're called to declare His promises over our lives, trusting that He is already working, even when we can't see it yet. What promises of God do you need to start declaring over your own life, even before you see the results? Faith also teaches us patience. Ezekiel had to wait as the bones came together piece by piece, and then wait again for God's breath to enter them. In the same way, our faith journey often involves waiting on God's timing. We might not see the full picture right away, but faith reminds us that God is always at work, even in the waiting. This doesn't mean sitting idly by. It means actively trusting God, continuing to pray, to declare His promises, and to believe that His plan is unfolding. How can you strengthen your faith during the waiting seasons of life? The story of Ezekiel and the dry bones is ultimately a story of hope. It's a reminder that no situation is too far gone for God to intervene. When we choose faith over fear, when we trust in God's promises over what we see with our eyes, we open ourselves up to experience the miraculous. Just as Ezekiel witnessed the bones come to life, we too can witness God's power at work in our lives. But it all begins with faith. Faith in the impossible, faith that God is who He says He is, and faith that He can bring life to even the driest of bones. What step of faith can you take today to trust God with the impossible? The Valley of Dry Bones is more than just a physical place. It's a profound metaphor for the challenges we face in life. Just like the scattered bones, there are moments in our lives when everything feels disjointed and lifeless. It might be a season of loss, a period of confusion, or a time when things seem to be falling apart. We all face valleys, and in those valleys, it can be hard to see how anything good could come from the broken pieces around us. But this story reminds us that even in the most desolate places, God can work miracles. What are the valleys you've walked through in your life? Life has a way of throwing us into valleys when we least expect it. Maybe it's a sudden job loss, the end of a relationship, or a health crisis that feels overwhelming. These valleys can make us feel isolated, abandoned, and without hope, much like the Israelites in exile. But just as God spoke life into the dry bones, He speaks life into the valleys of our lives. When we invite God into our struggles, we can trust that He's working, even when the situation looks bleak. Have you ever been in a valley where you felt hopeless, only to see God bring something amazing out of it? In the midst of our valleys, it's easy to feel stuck, like there's no way forward. The bones in the valley seemed beyond repair. Too dry, too scattered, too lifeless to ever be restored. But with God, nothing is too far gone. The Valley of Dry Bones teaches us that no matter how stuck we feel, God can bring life and restoration. This might mean healing from a broken heart, finding new purpose after a setback, or experiencing a renewed sense of faith. It's not about avoiding the valleys, but about trusting that God is with us in them. What does it look like to trust God in your own valley? One of the hardest parts of being in a valley is the feeling of waiting. Just like the bones in Ezekiel's vision didn't come to life all at once, restoration takes time. When we're in the middle of a struggle, it can feel like nothing is happening. But God is always at work, even when we can't see it. He is putting the pieces back together, preparing us for the moment when He will breathe new life into our situation. Have you ever been in a season where you felt like nothing was happening, only to realize later that God was working behind the scenes the whole time? Ultimately, the Valley of Dry Bones is a story of hope. It's a reminder that no matter how broken or lifeless things seem, God can bring them back to life. Whether you're facing challenges in your career, relationships, or personal growth, God's message to you is the same as it was to Ezekiel. Can these bones live? The answer is always yes, when God is involved. What if the valleys in your life are actually the starting point for a miracle? What if, like the dry bones, your struggles are about to be transformed into something new and full of life? One of the most powerful aspects of Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones is the way it demonstrates the importance of trusting in God's timing. The restoration didn't happen all at once. First, the bones came together, then the muscles, skin, and flesh formed, but the bodies were still lifeless. It wasn't until God breathed His Spirit into them that they came to life. This shows us that even when we start to see signs of restoration in our lives, it may not happen as quickly or in the way we expect. Trusting God's timing means believing that He is working even when things seem to be moving slowly. Have you ever felt frustrated by waiting for God's promises to come to life? It's easy to become impatient when we don't see immediate results. We live in a world that values instant gratification, but God's work in our lives often requires patience. Just as the bones in Ezekiel's vision didn't come together overnight, the restoration God is working in us may take time. This waiting can be challenging, especially when we feel like we're doing everything right but still don't see the results. But the story of the dry bones reminds us that God's timing is always perfect. His plan for our lives unfolds exactly when it's meant to, even if it feels delayed from our perspective. What might God be teaching you during the waiting season? Waiting for God's timing isn't about sitting idly by. It's about actively trusting and continuing to move forward in faith. Ezekiel didn't stop when the bones first came together. He kept speaking life until they were fully restored. In the same way, we are called to keep trusting, keep praying, and keep believing, even when we don't see the full picture. This kind of faith requires perseverance. It's easy to give up when things don't happen on our timeline, but God calls us to continue trusting in His promises, even when we don't yet see the outcome. How can you continue to move forward in faith while waiting for God's timing? Sometimes, the waiting is part of the process of preparation. Just as the bones had to be assembled before they could be brought to life, there are things that need to come together in our lives before we can experience the fullness of God's restoration. It might be that God is working on our character, teaching us patience, or preparing us for a greater blessing. What if the delays you're experiencing are actually part of God's plan to prepare you for something even greater than you imagined? Trusting God's timing means believing that He is working for our good, even when we can't see it yet. At the end of the day, trusting in God's timing is an act of faith. It's about believing that He is sovereign, that He knows what's best, and that His plans for us are good. The Israelites may have felt abandoned and forgotten during their exile, but God's promise of restoration was always in motion. In the same way, we can trust that even when things seem delayed, God is still working. His timing is perfect, and when the time is right, we will see the full restoration that He has promised. What would it look like for you to surrender your timeline to God and trust that He is working for your good? The miracle in Ezekiel's vision wasn't just about bones coming together. It was about the breath of life that transformed them from lifeless bodies into a living army. This breath represents the Spirit of God, and it's a reminder that true life comes only from Him. We can try to piece things together on our own, but without God's Spirit, it's like trying to live without breath. The story of the dry bones teaches us that no matter how much we work to restore things in our lives, it's only when God breathes His Spirit into them that they truly come to life. Have you ever tried to fix something on your own, only to realize you needed God's power to truly bring it to life? This breath of life is more than just physical. It's spiritual. The Israelites weren't just in need of a physical return to their land. They needed spiritual revival. In the same way, we often find ourselves in need of spiritual renewal. We might be going through the motions, but without God's Spirit breathing new life into us, we feel disconnected and dry. This story reminds us that true restoration comes when we invite God to breathe His life into us, renewing our faith, our hope, and our purpose. Where in your life do you need God to breathe new life? What's incredible about this miracle is that it didn't just bring the bones to life, it transformed them into a mighty army. This is a powerful symbol of how God doesn't just restore us to what we were before. He transforms us into something even greater. When God works in our lives, He doesn't just fix what's broken. He makes us stronger, more capable, and more aligned with His purpose. The dry bones didn't just come back to life. They became a force to be reckoned with. How might God be preparing you for something greater through the process of restoration? The breath of God represents the Holy Spirit, who empowers and equips us for the life we're called to live. Just as the breath brought the bones to life, the Holy Spirit brings us to life spiritually, guiding us, strengthening us, and helping us to fulfill our purpose. Without the Spirit, we're just going through the motions, but with Him, we are empowered to live the life God has called us to. What difference would it make in your life if you invited the Holy Spirit to breathe new life into you, guiding you in every area of your journey? Ultimately, the miracle of new life in this story is a promise to all of us. No matter how dry, broken, or lifeless things seem, God's Spirit can breathe new life into any situation. It's a reminder that with God, nothing is too far gone to be restored. Whether it's a personal struggle, a dream that feels lost, or a relationship that seems beyond repair, God's Spirit can bring new life where there seems to be none. What if the miracle of new life is waiting for you, just on the other side of faith? One of the most important aspects of Ezekiel's vision is his obedience to God's command. When God asked Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, He was giving him a task that seemed impossible. Speaking to dry, lifeless bones might have felt pointless, but Ezekiel obeyed without hesitation. His faith and obedience set the stage for the miracle that was about to unfold. This teaches us an essential lesson. Sometimes, God calls us to take action even when it doesn't make sense. Have you ever felt called to do something that didn't seem logical, but you felt God leading you? Obedience is a critical part of faith. Ezekiel didn't understand how his words could bring life to the bones, but he trusted God enough to follow through. In our own lives, we may not always see the bigger picture or understand how our actions fit into God's plan, but obedience opens the door for God to work in miraculous ways. It's in those moments of obedience, when we act in faith, that God often reveals His power. What step of obedience is God asking you to take in your life right now, even if it doesn't make sense? What's striking about Ezekiel's obedience is that it wasn't passive. He didn't just sit back and wait for God to do all the work. He actively participated in the miracle by speaking to the bones. This reminds us that while God is the one who brings restoration and life, He often invites us to be part of the process. Whether it's through prayer, speaking words of faith, or taking specific actions, our obedience plays a role in the miracles God wants to perform in our lives. How can you actively participate in God's work of restoration in your own life? Ezekiel's obedience also shows us the power of words. By speaking life to the bones, Ezekiel demonstrated the importance of declaring God's promises, even when the situation looks hopeless. In our own lives, we have the power to speak life or death over our circumstances. When we choose to speak words of faith and hope, we align ourselves with God's promises and open the door for His Spirit to work. What words are you speaking over your life right now? Are they words of faith and hope, or words of doubt and fear? Ultimately, Ezekiel's obedience led to one of the most miraculous displays of God's power in the Bible. This story reminds us that when we obey God, even in the face of impossible circumstances, we can witness His miraculous work in our lives. It's a call to trust in God's commands, even when they don't make sense to us, and to believe that He is always working for our good. What would it look like for you to trust and obey God more fully in your current situation, even if it feels like an impossible task? In Ezekiel's vision, prophecy played a central role in the restoration of the dry bones. When God instructed Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, it was through his words that the process of restoration began. This highlights the power of prophecy, not just in foretelling the future but in speaking God's truth into present situations. Ezekiel's words, empowered by God, began to physically restore the bones, connecting them and eventually bringing them to life. This teaches us that speaking God's promises can have a tangible impact on the broken areas of our lives. Have you ever spoken God's promises over a situation and seen things start to shift? Prophecy, in this context, is about more than predicting outcomes. It's about declaring God's truth in the midst of what seems impossible. When we speak words of faith, we're aligning ourselves with God's will and inviting His Spirit to move in powerful ways. Just as Ezekiel's prophecy sparked the restoration of the bones, speaking God's promises over our own lives can spark the beginning of a miracle. How can you start speaking God's truth into the areas of your life that need restoration? Another important aspect of prophecy is that it requires faith. Ezekiel had to trust that God's words, spoken through him, would make a difference. In the same way, when we declare God's promises over our lives, we may not see immediate results, but faith calls us to continue speaking and trusting that God is at work. It's easy to get discouraged when things don't change right away, but prophecy reminds us to keep speaking life, even when the situation still looks dry. What area of your life needs a consistent declaration of faith, even if you haven't seen the results yet? Prophecy also empowers us to see beyond the current circumstances. When Ezekiel looked at the valley of bones, he saw death and decay, but through prophecy, he was able to see the potential for life. This is a powerful reminder that God often calls us to look beyond what's in front of us and to focus on what He is capable of doing. Prophecy helps us shift our perspective from what's broken to what's possible with God. What shift in perspective could help you see your current challenges in a new light? Ultimately, prophecy is about partnership with God. Just as Ezekiel partnered with God to bring the bones to life, we are called to partner with God in the restoration of our own lives. This partnership requires faith, trust, and a willingness to speak life into dead situations. Through prophecy, we participate in God's work of restoration, aligning ourselves with His power and His promises. What step can you take today to partner with God in the restoration of your life? At its core, Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones is a message of hope. It reminds us that no matter how lifeless or broken a situation may seem, God has the power to bring restoration and new life. The scattered bones in the valley represented a nation that had lost everything: its land, its temple, and its connection to God. Yet, God showed Ezekiel that even in the midst of that hopelessness, He could bring about a miraculous transformation. Have you ever experienced a time when hope seemed out of reach, but God stepped in and turned things around? This story isn't just about what God did for Israel. It's a message for all of us. We all face times in our lives when we feel like the dry bones in the valley, disconnected, lifeless, and without hope. But this vision reminds us that with God, nothing is ever truly lost. His power to restore is greater than any obstacle we face. Whether it's a personal challenge, a relationship that's broken, or a dream that seems dead, God can breathe new life into it. What area of your life do you need to invite God's restoration into? The power of this message is that it invites us to trust in God's ability to do the impossible. It's easy to get discouraged when we look at the broken areas of our lives, but this story shows us that God is always at work, even when we can't see it. Just as He brought the bones back to life, He can bring hope and restoration to any situation we face. The challenge for us is to keep believing, even when the situation looks bleak. What would it look like for you to trust God more fully in the areas of your life that feel hopeless? Ezekiel's vision also teaches us that restoration is often a process. The bones didn't come to life instantly. They were assembled piece by piece, and it wasn't until God breathed His Spirit into them that they became fully alive. In the same way, the restoration God works in our lives may happen gradually. It requires patience, faith, and a willingness to trust that God's timing is perfect. What process of restoration is God working on in your life right now, and how can you trust His timing? Ultimately, this vision is a powerful reminder that with God, nothing is too far gone to be restored. His power to bring life to what seems dead is unmatched, and His desire to restore us is rooted in His love. No matter where we find ourselves, whether in a valley of dry bones or on the path to restoration, God's promise remains the same. He is with us, and He is working to bring new life. What if the areas of your life that seem the most hopeless are actually the places where God is about to work His greatest miracles? Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones isn't just a story of national restoration for Israel. It's a powerful example of personal transformation that applies to each of us. The dry bones represent areas of our lives that feel lifeless or beyond repair, but God's power can bring them back to life. Just as God breathed His Spirit into those bones, He can breathe new life into us, transforming our hearts, minds, and spirits. Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where you felt completely changed by God's presence? This transformation isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about becoming something new. When the bones in Ezekiel's vision came together, they didn't just become ordinary people, they became a mighty army. In the same way, God doesn't just restore us to where we were before. He transforms us into something stronger, more capable, and more aligned with His purpose. What area of your life do you need to surrender to God so that He can transform it into something greater? Personal transformation through God's power requires faith and surrender. It's easy to hold on to the things in our lives that feel safe or comfortable, but true transformation comes when we let go and allow God to work in us. This may involve stepping out in faith, trusting God with areas of our lives that we've kept hidden, or embracing new opportunities that He places in our path. What is one step you can take today to trust God with your personal transformation? One of the most beautiful aspects of God's transformative power is that it's available to everyone, no matter where they are in life. Whether you feel strong in your faith or distant from God, His Spirit is always ready to bring new life. This story reminds us that it's never too late for God to work a miracle in our lives. Even the driest, most lifeless areas can be revived by His power. What part of your life do you believe God is calling you to transform? Ultimately, the story of the dry bones is a message of hope and possibility. It shows us that no matter how hopeless things seem, God's power can bring about radical change. Whether it's a personal challenge, a relationship, or a dream that feels dead, God can breathe new life into it. And when He does, we are not just restored, we are transformed. What if the next step in your journey is not just restoration but a complete transformation into the person God has called you to be? Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones isn't just a one-time event. It's a reminder of God's ongoing promise of restoration in our lives. Just as He restored Israel from a place of hopelessness, God continues to work in our lives, bringing restoration to the areas that feel broken, lost, or forgotten. This story is a powerful testimony to the fact that God's work is never finished. He is always in the process of restoring us. Have you experienced a time when you thought something was over, only for God to bring it back to life? God's promise of restoration is ongoing because life constantly brings new challenges. We face seasons of loss, disappointment, and hardship, but God's promise remains the same. He can bring life where there seems to be only death. This isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about renewing and strengthening us for the journey ahead. The dry bones didn't just come together and stand. They became a living, breathing army. How might God be preparing you for something greater through the process of restoration? What's encouraging about this story is that it teaches us to have hope even in the most difficult times. When we feel like giving up, when we're in the valleys of life, God's promise of restoration reminds us that He is always working, even when we can't see it. The restoration may not come immediately, but we can trust that God's timing is perfect, and His plan is unfolding exactly as it should. How can you hold on to hope during the seasons of waiting in your life? This ongoing promise also invites us to be patient with ourselves and with the process. Just as the bones in Ezekiel's vision came together gradually, the restoration God is working in our lives often happens piece by piece. We may not see the full picture right away, but we can trust that God is bringing everything together for our good. What steps of faith can you take today, knowing that God is working on your restoration even if you don't see the full result yet? Ultimately, the vision of the dry bones is a story of hope that continues to resonate with us today. It reminds us that no matter where we find ourselves, God's promise of restoration is always available. He is the God who brings life to what seems dead, who restores what seems lost, and who transforms us into something even greater than before. What if your greatest challenges are actually the areas where God is about to bring His greatest restoration? The story of Ezekiel and the miracle in the Valley of Dry Bones reminds us that God is a specialist in restoring what seems lost. If He can bring life to dry and forgotten bones, imagine what He can do in your life. No matter what you're facing, there is no situation that is impossible for God. Maybe today you're going through a valley in your life, a moment of doubt, fear, or even despair. But remember, God is ready to breathe new life into your challenges. All you need to do is trust and take the first step of faith. And if this message touched your heart, challenged you, or inspired you in any way, I invite you to like this video and share it with someone who also needs to hear this message of hope and restoration. Together, we can spread this powerful word. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep following more stories and teachings like this one. Let's continue this journey of faith together, believing that God's miracles still happen today, just like in the Valley of Dry Bones.